This theory is supported by the fact that one of the posts was found with a bundle of what appears to have been rattles or noise-making objects attached to it, suggesting that it may have been used in a context where sound, specifically the sound of rattling or shaking, played a role in the ritual activity. In many pre-Christian European traditions, noise-making was believed to drive away evil spirits, and the combination of a terrifying visual image with a loud, startling sound would have created a potent sensory experience designed to establish spiritual boundaries and to protect the living or the dead from malevolent forces. If this interpretation is correct, then the animal head posts may represent a dimension of Norse religious practice that is otherwise largely invisible in the archaeological record, a dimension concerned not with the great cosmic narratives of gods and giants, but with the more intimate, everyday business of navigating a world that was believed to be populated by a host of unseen beings, some benevolent, some hostile, all requiring careful management through ritual action. Another category of objects from the Oseberg burial that has attracted intense scholarly attention is the collection of domestic and agricultural equipment, items that might seem mundane in comparison to the elaborately carved wooden objects, but that are, in many ways, equally revealing. The burial contained a full range of kitchen equipment, including iron cauldrons, wooden troughs, knives, and a hand mill for grinding grain, as well as implements associated with dairying, such as milk strainers and butter-making equipment. These objects speak to the centrality of food production and preparation in the daily life of the Norse household, and their inclusion in the burial suggests that the occupants were expected to continue the domestic routines of their earthly existence in the afterlife, a belief that is consistent with the broader Norse understanding of death as a continuation of life rather than a cessation of it. The dead needed to eat, to drink, to cook, and to manage a household just as they had in life, and the living had a responsibility to ensure that they were properly equipped for these tasks. The textile working equipment found in the burial is particularly significant because it connects the Oseberg women to what was perhaps the single most important economic activity of the Norse household, the production of cloth. In Viking Age Scandinavia, textile production was primarily the work of women, and it encompassed a complex chain of activities that began with the shearing of sheep or the gathering of plant fibers and proceeded through the stages of carding, spinning, dyeing, and weaving to the creation of finished fabrics that could be used for clothing, bedding, sails, and trade goods. The importance of this work can hardly be overstated. Cloth was not merely a commodity, it was a form of wealth, a medium of exchange, and a marker of social status. And the ability to produce fine textiles was one of the most valued skills that a woman could possess. The Oseberg burial contained not only the tools of textile production, the loom, the spindle whorls, the weaving tablets, and the shears, but also the products themselves, the tapestry fragments, and woven fabrics that testify to the extraordinary skill of the craftswomen who made them. The tapestry fragments are particularly precious because they are among the only surviving examples of Viking Age pictorial weaving, a tradition that is known from literary sources but that has almost entirely perished from the archaeological record. The fragments show processions of figures, some on foot and some on horseback or in wagons, moving across a landscape that includes what appear to be buildings, trees, and other elements of an outdoor setting. The figures are dressed in elaborate garments and carry objects that may include weapons, banners, or ritual implements, and their poses and gestures suggest a scene of ceremonial or religious significance. Some scholars have interpreted the tapestry scenes as depictions of a funeral procession, perhaps even the funeral of the Oseberg women themselves, while others have seen them as representations of mythological narratives, seasonal festivals, or royal ceremonies. The fragmentary nature of the surviving material makes definitive interpretation impossible, but the tapestries nonetheless provide an invaluable and otherwise unobtainable glimpse into the visual culture of the Viking Age, a culture that was clearly rich in narrative imagery and symbolic meaning, but that expressed itself primarily in perishable materials, wood, cloth, and leather that have rarely survived the passage of time. The question of the Oseberg women's identities and their significance within Norse society connects to a broader scholarly conversation about the roles and status of women in the Viking Age, a conversation that has been transformed in recent decades by a combination of new archaeological discoveries, new analytical techniques, and new theoretical perspectives. The traditional view of Viking Age Scandinavia as a predominantly patriarchal society in which women played subordinate roles has been increasingly challenged by evidence suggesting that women could and did exercise considerable power, influence, and autonomy, at least in certain contexts and at certain social levels. The Oseberg burial is one of the most important pieces of evidence in this reassessment, but it is far from the only one. Female burials of considerable richness have been found at sites across the Norse world, from Sweden to Iceland to the Norse settlements in the British Isles, and the grave goods associated with these burials, which often include keys, a symbol of household authority, as well as jewelry, textile working equipment, and sometimes weapons, suggest that women occupied a range of social roles that went well beyond the domestic sphere. The literary sources too, though they must be used with caution, offer glimpses of women who wielded power in ways that challenge simple stereotypes. The sagas are populated by strong, intelligent, sometimes ruthless female characters who influence the course of events through their words, their actions, and their control of social networks and economic resources. Queens and noblewomen appear as political actors in their own right, arranging marriages, managing estates, settling disputes, and sometimes inciting or restraining violence. The figure of the Velva, the female seer or prophetess, occupies a particularly important place in Norse literature and religion, appearing in the mythological sources as a possessor of profound wisdom and spiritual power, a woman who could see the future, communicate with the dead, and influence the course of fate through her ritual practices. Some scholars have suggested that one or both of the Oseberg women may have been a Velva, a religious specialist whose authority derived not from military prowess or political office, but from her perceived ability to mediate between the human world and the world of the gods, and the presence of certain unusual objects in the burial, including a staff-like object and a pouch containing cannabis seeds, has been cited as possible evidence for this interpretation, though the evidence is far from conclusive. The cannabis seeds found in the Oseberg burial are a small but intriguing detail that has generated considerable discussion. Cannabis was known in Scandinavia during the Viking Age, primarily as a source of hemp fiber for rope and textile production, but the plant also has well-known psychoactive properties, and some scholars have speculated that the seeds found in the burial may have been intended for use in ritual contexts, perhaps as part of the visionary practices associated with the Velva or other religious specialists. The idea that the Norse may have used psychoactive substances as part of their spiritual practices is not implausible. The Berserkers, the legendary Viking warriors who fought in a state of frenzied ecstasy, have long been suspected of ingesting some form of mind-altering substance before battle, with candidates including alcohol, the fly agaric mushroom, and various herbal preparations. The cannabis seeds from the Oseberg burial do not prove that the women buried there were practitioners of altered state rituals, but they add another layer of suggestive detail to an already complex and fascinating picture. Beyond the specific objects and their possible interpretations, the Oseberg burial as a whole offers a meditation on the nature of power, memory, and mortality in the Viking Age. The construction of the mound, the elaborate preparation of the ship and its contents, the sacrifice of the animals, and the possible sacrifice of one of the human occupants were all acts of tremendous social and economic investment, acts that consumed resources, labor, and time on a scale that would have been felt by the entire community. This investment was not made lightly. It was a deliberate and purposeful expression of the values and beliefs that governed Norse society, a statement about the importance of honoring the dead, of maintaining the connections between the living and their ancestors, and of demonstrating to the world that the lineage and family of the deceased possessed the wealth, the piety, and the social authority to stage a farewell that would be remembered for generations. The mound itself was a monument, a physical mark on the landscape that declared the presence and the importance of the dead to every passerby, to every traveler who sailed past on the fjord, to every farmer who worked the surrounding fields. In a society without written records, without newspapers or official chronicles, the burial mound was one of the primary means by which memory was inscribed on the landscape, and the great mounds of Vestfold, including the Oseberg mound, served as anchors of collective identity, connecting the present to the past and lending legitimacy and prestige to those who could claim descent from the individuals buried within them. The sagas are filled with references to the mounds of ancestral kings and queens, and the act of sitting on or visiting a burial mound was understood as a means of communing with the dead, of seeking their wisdom and their approval, and of drawing upon the accumulated power and prestige of the lineage. This relationship between the living and the dead was not merely symbolic or metaphorical, it was experienced as real and immediate, a tangible connection that could be felt and cultivated through ritual action. The Norse did not think of their dead as gone, as absent, as removed to some distant and inaccessible realm. The dead were present, inhabiting their mounds, watching over their descendants, capable of offering guidance and protection, but also capable of inflicting harm if they were neglected or dishonored. The concept of the Draugr, the undead being who dwells within the burial mound and guards its treasures with jealous ferocity, is a reflection of this belief, a vivid expression of the anxiety and the reverence that the Norse felt toward their dead, an acknowledgement that the boundary between the living and the dead was not a wall but a membrane, permeable and dangerous, requiring constant attention and careful management. The Oseberg burial, in its totality, is one of the most eloquent expressions of this complex and profound relationship with death that has survived from any period of European history. It is a document of faith and of art, of power and of tenderness, of the human desire to send the dead well provisioned into whatever awaits them on the other side of the darkness. And it is a document that continues to speak to us across more than 1,000 years of silence, with a voice that is all the more powerful for being composed, not of words but of objects, of carved wood and woven cloth, of iron nails and animal bones, of a ship that once sailed the waters of the fjord and that was then entrusted to the earth, along with its mysterious passengers, in an act of devotion that time has not diminished. The conservation and display of the Oseberg ship and its associated finds became one of the defining cultural projects of modern Norway, a project that extended across the entire 20th century and that continues into the 21st. After the excavation of 1904, the ship's timbers were transported to the University of Christiania, where they were subjected to the alum conservation treatment described earlier, and then painstakingly reassembled in a process that took years of careful work. The reconstruction of the ship required not only technical skill but also a degree of interpretive judgment, because many of the timbers had been crushed and distorted by the weight of the mound and some had been damaged or lost, requiring educated guesses about their original positions and relationships. The result, when the ship was finally displayed in a temporary exhibition space, was a revelation, a vessel of haunting beauty, its dark age, stained timbers rising in elegant curves, its carved prow reaching upward like the neck of a great sea creature, its form conveying a sense of speed and grace that seemed to defy the 1,000 years it had spent buried in the earth. The question of where to permanently house the Oseberg ship and the other two great Viking ships, the Gokstad and the Tune, became a matter of national importance in Norway. The ships were more than archaeological artifacts. They were symbols of national identity, tangible links to a heroic past that had played a central role in the construction of Norwegian nationalism during the 19th and early 20th centuries, a period when Norway was asserting its cultural and political distinctiveness, first within the union with Sweden and then, after independence in 1905, as a sovereign nation seeking to define its place in the modern world. The decision was made to build a dedicated museum to house the ships, and the architect chosen for the task was Arnstein Arneberg, a prominent figure in Norwegian architectural circles who designed a building that was at once monumental and restrained, a structure of clean white walls and vaulted ceilings that allowed the ships to be displayed in spacious, cathedral-like galleries where visitors could appreciate them in something approaching the awe and reverence that their creators had intended to inspire. The Viking Ship Museum, or Viking Skipshuset, opened on the Bygdøy Peninsula in Oslo in 1926, with the Oseberg ship as its centerpiece, and it quickly became one of the most visited cultural institutions in Scandinavia, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors each year who came to stand before the ships and to marvel at the skill of the people who had built them. The experience of seeing the Oseberg ship in person is one that few visitors forget. The sheer size of the vessel, the intricacy of the carvings, the warm dark color of the ancient wood, all combine to create an impression of something simultaneously very old and very alive, as though the ship is merely resting between voyages, waiting for the signal to set out once more across the water. The associated artifacts, displayed in cases and on platforms around the ship, add depth and context to the experience, allowing visitors to appreciate not just the ship itself, but the entire world that it represents, the world of the Oseberg women, and the society that honored them. The museum's displays, however, have always represented a compromise between the desire to show as much as possible and the need to protect fragile objects from the damaging effects of light, humidity, and temperature fluctuation. Many of the most delicate artifacts, including the tapestry fragments and some of the more deteriorated wooden objects, have been kept in storage or displayed only intermittently, and the ongoing conservation challenges posed by the alum-treated wood have added a note of urgency to the question of how best to care for these irreplaceable treasures. In the early 21st century, researchers at the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo began to raise the alarm about the condition of many of the Oseberg objects, noting that the alum within the wood was continuing to degrade, producing sulfuric acid that was slowly eating away at the remaining wood fibers and causing some objects to become dangerously fragile. A major research and conservation initiative was launched, bringing together specialists from across Europe and employing cutting-edge analytical techniques, including synchrotron radiation, mass spectrometry, and advanced imaging technologies to assess the condition of the objects and to develop new conservation strategies that could stabilize them for future generations. This conservation effort has produced some remarkable results, including a much deeper understanding of the chemical processes involved in the degradation of alum-treated wood and the development of new treatment methods that show promise for slowing or halting the damage. But the work is far from complete, and the sheer number of objects in need of attention, combined with the complexity of the conservation challenges involved, means that the task of preserving the Oseberg finds will continue for many years, perhaps many decades, to come. The story of the Oseberg ship, in this sense, is a story about the responsibilities that come with discovery, about the obligation to protect and preserve what we have been fortunate enough to find, and about the recognition that the past is not a static entity safely locked away behind glass, but a living, breathing presence that requires ongoing care and attention if it is to survive. In recent years, the Norwegian government has announced plans to build a new museum to replace the aging Viking ship museum on Yggdrasil, a project that has been the subject of intense public interest and debate. The new museum, designed by the architectural firm AART and tentatively named the Museum of the Viking Age, is intended to provide a state-of-the-art facility for the display and conservation of the ships and their associated finds, with expanded exhibition spaces, advanced climate control systems, and new interpretive frameworks that will present the Viking Age in the light of the most current scholarship. The project has faced challenges, including cost overruns, construction delays, and controversy over the decision to move the ships, a process that carries inherent risks given the fragile condition of the alum-treated wood. But the fundamental impulse behind the project, the desire to ensure that the Oseberg ship and its companions can be experienced by future generations in a setting that does justice to their significance, is one that reflects the enduring power of these objects to inspire wonder, curiosity, and a sense of connection to the deep past. The influence of the Oseberg discovery on the broader study of the Viking Age can hardly be overstated. Before the excavation of 1904, the popular image of the Vikings was dominated by the written sources, by the sagas and the chronicles, and the accounts of terrified monks who had watched their monasteries burn, and by a tradition of romantic nationalism that had created an idealized picture of the Norse as noble barbarians, heroic warriors of the frozen north whose virtues of courage, loyalty, and independence were the foundations of modern Scandinavian identity. The Oseberg find did not overturn this image entirely, but it complicated it enormously, adding layers of nuance and detail that the written sources alone could never have provided. Here was evidence of a culture that valued beauty as well as strength, that invested enormous resources in the arts of peace as well as the arts of war, that honored women as well as men, and that possessed a spiritual and symbolic vocabulary of astonishing richness and complexity. The Oseberg ship and its contents forced scholars to reconsider many of their assumptions about Norse society and to develop new frameworks for understanding a civilization that was clearly far more multifaceted than the popular stereotype allowed. The impact of the Oseberg discovery has extended well beyond the academy, influencing art, design, literature, and popular culture in ways that continue to be felt today. The distinctive animal ornament of the Oseberg style, with its interlocking, sinuous forms and its dynamic interplay of figure and ground, has been a source of inspiration for artists and designers across Scandinavia and around the world, and elements of the Oseberg aesthetic can be seen in everything from jewelry and tattoo designs to architectural ornament and graphic art. The image of the Oseberg ship itself, with its soaring prow and elegant lines, has become one of the most recognizable symbols of the Viking Age, reproduced on everything from postage stamps and banknotes to tourist souvenirs and corporate logos, a visual shorthand for the power, beauty, and mystery of the Norse world. In literature and popular media, the Oseberg discovery has fueled a fascination with Viking Age women that has only grown stronger in recent years, as scholars and storytellers alike have sought to recover and celebrate the stories of the women who lived and died in the Norse world. The figure of the Shield Maiden, the female warrior who fights alongside men in battle, has become a staple of popular Viking fiction, and while the historical evidence for the existence of actual shield maidens is debated, the Oseberg burial has played a significant role in creating a cultural climate in which the idea of powerful, autonomous Viking women is taken seriously and explored with enthusiasm. The two Oseberg women, nameless and mysterious as they remain, have become icons of a lost world, figures onto whom modern audiences project their own hopes, fears, and fascinations, and through whom they seek to understand something about the nature of power, identity, and the human relationship with death. The scholarly study of the Oseberg finds has continued to evolve, driven by new technologies and new questions. In addition to the DNA analysis and radiocarbon dating mentioned earlier, researchers have employed a range of analytical techniques to extract information from the objects that was previously inaccessible. Isotopic analysis of the skeletal remains has provided clues about the diets and geographic origins of the two women, suggesting that they consumed a diet rich in terrestrial animal protein, consistent with the diet of elite individuals in the Norse world, and that at least one of them may have spent part of her life outside the Vestfold region. Analysis of the wood used in the construction of the ship and the grave goods has identified the species and, in some cases, the geographic provenance of the timber, revealing that the ship was built primarily of oak, a wood that was highly valued in the Norse world for its strength and durability, and that was becoming increasingly scarce in some parts of Scandinavia by the 9th century. Dendrochronological analysis, the study of tree ring patterns, has provided precise dates for the felling of the timber and has confirmed that the ship was constructed in the early 9th century, consistent with the other dating of it. The study of the Oseberg textiles has been particularly rewarding, yielding insights not only into the techniques and aesthetics of Norse textile production, but also into the trade networks and cultural contacts that connected Scandinavia to the wider world. Analysis of the dyes used in the tapestry fragments has identified a range of coloring agents, including madder red, weld, yellow, and indigo blue, some of which were locally sourced and others of which were imported from distant regions, testimony to the reach and sophistication of the Norse trade networks. The weaving techniques employed in the textiles include both simple tabby weave and more complex patterns that required considerable skill and experience to execute, and the quality of the finished products is comparable to the finest textiles produced anywhere in contemporary Europe, a fact that underscores the importance of textile production as a form of high-status artistic expression in the Norse world. The animals found in the Oseberg burial have also been the subject of detailed study, and their analysis has provided valuable information about animal husbandry, ritual practice, and the symbolic dimensions of the Norse relationship with the natural world. The 15 horses found in the burial were not a random selection of available animals, but appear to have been carefully chosen, and some of them show signs of having been specially bred or maintained, suggesting that they were high-status animals, perhaps the personal mounts of the deceased or animals with particular ritual significance. The dogs, too, were likely animals of some importance, and their sacrifice and inclusion in the burial reflects the deep bond between humans and dogs that is well attested in Norse culture, where dogs served as companions, hunters, and guardians, and where the dog was associated with loyalty, protection, and the passage between worlds. The two small cows may have been included to provide a supply of milk and dairy products in the afterlife, a practical consideration that reflects the importance of dairy farming in the Norse economy and the belief that the dead would continue to need sustenance in their new existence. One of the most thought-provoking aspects of the Oseberg burial is the evidence of deliberate disturbance that was noted during the original excavation, and that has been the subject of renewed investigation in recent years. As mentioned earlier, the burial chamber was broken into at some point in the medieval period, and the skeletal remains of the two women were found in a disarranged state, scattered across the floor of the chamber rather than lying in their original positions. The robbers appeared to have been interested primarily in metal objects, particularly gold and silver jewelry and ornaments, and they seem to have removed these items while leaving the wooden and textile objects largely untouched. But some scholars have questioned whether the disturbance was purely motivated by greed or whether it may have had a ritual or political dimension as well. In Norse culture, the disturbance of a burial mound was a deeply significant act, fraught with spiritual danger and social meaning. And there are instances in the sagas where the opening of a burial mound is described as an act of deliberate desecration intended to humiliate the dead and to strip their descendants of the prestige and spiritual power that the mound conferred. It is possible, though far from certain, that the disturbance of the Oseberg burial was an act of this kind, motivated not by a desire for treasure, but by a desire to diminish the power and memory of the individuals buried within the mound, perhaps in the context of a political or dynastic struggle that has left no other trace in the historical record. This possibility adds yet another layer of complexity to the already rich and multifaceted story of the Oseberg ship and its occupants, a story that encompasses not only the moment of burial and the moment of discovery, but also the long, silent centuries in between. Centuries during which the mound sat quietly in the Norwegian landscape, guarding its secrets, weathering the passage of time, surviving the conversion to Christianity, the political upheavals of the medieval period, the Black Death, the Reformation, and the slow, grinding processes of agricultural expansion and modernization that transformed the countryside of Vestfold from a landscape of forests and scattered farms into the orderly, productive agricultural region that it is today. Through all of these changes, the mound endured, a silent witness to the transformations of Norwegian society, a link between the present and a past that was both forgotten and remembered, both lost and preserved, both inaccessible and, as it turned out, merely waiting to be found. The discovery of the Oseberg ship did not occur in an intellectual vacuum, but rather emerged at a moment in European history when the study of the past was itself undergoing a profound transformation, when the disciplines of archaeology, anthropology, and art history were coalescing into recognizable forms, and when the nations of Northern Europe were engaged in an intense and sometimes competitive process of cultural self-definition that drew heavily upon the material remains of the ancient and medieval past. To understand why the Oseberg find had the impact that it did, and why it continues to resonate so powerfully in the 21st century, one must appreciate the broader cultural and intellectual currents that shaped its reception and interpretation, currents that flowed through the universities and museums of Scandinavia, and that connected the quiet farmlands of Vestfold to the great debate about identity, nationhood, and the meaning of history that were roiling across Europe in the years before the First World War. The 19th century had been a period of extraordinary growth and development in the field of Scandinavian archaeology, driven by a combination of institutional support, public enthusiasm, and the tireless efforts of individual scholars and collectors who recognized that the soil of the north contained treasures of incalculable value. The Danish scholar Christian Jørgensen Thomsen had laid the foundations of modern archaeological classification with his three-age system, dividing the prehistoric past into the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age based on the dominant materials used for tools and weapons in each period. And this framework had been adopted and refined by scholars across Scandinavia and beyond, providing a systematic vocabulary for organizing and interpreting the vast and bewildering array of objects that were being pulled from the earth at an ever-increasing rate. In Sweden, the antiquarian tradition was equally vigorous, with major excavations at sites like Birka, the great Viking Age trading center on the island of Björka in Lake Mälaren, yielding rich assemblages of artifacts that illuminated the commercial and cultural networks of the early medieval North. And in Norway, the discoveries at Thun and Gokstad had already demonstrated the extraordinary potential of the Vestfold region as a source of Viking Age material, setting the stage for the even greater revelation that awaited at Oseberg. The relationship between archaeology and nationalism in 19th and early 20th century Scandinavia was complex and sometimes problematic. The recovery and display of ancient artifacts was not merely an academic exercise, it was a political act, a means of constructing and validating national narratives that connected the modern nation-state to a glorious and heroic past. In Norway, where the struggle for independence from Sweden was the defining political issue of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Viking Age held a special place in the national imagination, representing a period when the Norse had been masters of their own destiny, when they had sailed the seas, explored new worlds, and built a civilization of power and beauty that the rest of Europe had both feared and admired. The discovery of the great Viking ships was seized upon by Norwegian nationalists as proof of the country's unique heritage and as a justification for its claim to full sovereignty and independence, and the ships themselves became potent symbols of national identity, displayed in public with a reverence and a pride that bordered on the religious. This nationalist appropriation of the Viking past was not without its dangers, and it would take on darker dimensions in the 20th century when elements of Norse mythology and Viking Age symbolism were co-opted by far-right and fascist movements, most notoriously by the Nazi regime in Germany and its ideological allies in Scandinavia, who sought to claim the Vikings as proto-Aryan heroes and to use the imagery of the Norse past to legitimize their racist and expansionist agendas. The misuse of Viking Age symbolism by extremist groups is a painful chapter in the history of Norse studies, and it has forced scholars to be ever vigilant about the ways in which the past can be distorted and weaponized in the service of contemporary political agendas. The Oseberg ship and its contents, precisely because they are so beautiful and so evocative, have been particularly susceptible to this kind of appropriation, and scholars have had to work hard to ensure that the finds are presented and interpreted in a manner that is faithful to the complexity and the humanity of the culture that produced them, rather than being reduced to simplistic symbols of racial or national superiority. In the decades following the Oseberg excavation, the study of Viking Age art was transformed by the work of scholars who undertook a systematic analysis of the decorative styles represented on the ship and its associated objects, developing a chronological and typological framework that remains the foundation of the field to this day. The most influential of these scholars was the Norwegian art historian Håkon Shetelig, who worked closely with Gustafson during the excavation and who subsequently devoted years to the study and publication of the Oseberg finds, producing detailed descriptions and analyses of the carved objects that established the basic vocabulary of Viking Age art historical scholarship. Shetelig's work was continued and expanded by later scholars, most notably the Swedish art historian Bernhard Salin, who had already developed a system for classifying the animal ornament of the Migration period and the Vendel period, the centuries immediately preceding the Viking Age, and whose methods provided a template for the analysis of Viking Age decorative styles. The classification of Viking Age art styles that emerged from this scholarship identifies a series of distinctive phases or traditions, each characterized by specific features of design, composition, and technique, and each named after a key site or object that exemplifies the style. The Oseberg style, the earliest of the recognized Viking Age art styles, is characterized by its use of gripping beasts, small, dynamic animal figures whose paws grip the borders of the composition, adjacent animals, or their own bodies, creating a sense of energy and movement that is distinctive and immediately recognizable. This gripping beast motif, which has no clear precedent in earlier Scandinavian art, seems to have emerged in the late 8th or early 9th century, roughly coinciding with the beginning of the Viking Age itself, and its appearance on the Oseberg ship and its associated objects places the burial at the very inception of a new artistic tradition that would evolve and diversify over the following 2.5 centuries, producing a series of styles: the Bore style, the Jelling style, the Mammon style, the Ringerike style, and the Urn style, that together constitute one of the most remarkable and sustained traditions of decorative art in European history. The significance of this artistic tradition extends far beyond the realm of aesthetics. The decorative styles of the Viking Age were not merely ornamental, they were a form of communication, a visual language through which the Norse expressed their identity, their beliefs, their social affiliations, and their understanding of the world. The animal ornament that dominates Viking Age art is not random or purely decorative. It draws upon a symbolic vocabulary that was deeply rooted in Norse cosmology and that conveyed meanings that would have been immediately intelligible to contemporary viewers, but that are often difficult for modern scholars to decode. The intertwining serpents, the gripping beasts, the great cats and birds that populate the surfaces of Norse metalwork, wood carving, and stonework are not merely decorative motifs, but symbolic actors in a visual drama that reflects the Norse understanding of the forces that governed the cosmos, the endless struggle between order and chaos, the intertwining of fate and free will, the transformation and renewal that characterized the cycle of life and death. The Oseberg ship, with its extraordinary density of carved decoration, is one of the richest sources for the study of this visual language, and scholars have spent generations attempting to decode the messages that its surfaces convey. The serpentine forms that wind along the ship's stem post and stern post, the gripping beasts that cluster on the upper strakes, the complex interlaced patterns that cover the surfaces of the sledges and the cart, all of these elements are part of a coherent symbolic program that was designed to serve a specific purpose within the context of the burial, though the precise nature of that purpose remains a matter of scholarly debate. Some scholars have argued that the decoration was primarily protective, intended to guard the ship and its occupants from harmful forces during their journey to the afterlife, while others have suggested that it was primarily commemorative, intended to celebrate the achievements and the status of the deceased, and still others have proposed that it was primarily cosmological, intended to depict or evoke the structure of the Norse universe and to locate the burial within the larger framework of mythological time and space. The truth, as is so often the case in the study of complex symbolic systems, is probably that the decoration served all of these functions simultaneously, operating on multiple levels of meaning that reinforced and enriched each other. The Norse were not a people who compartmentalized their understanding of the world into neat, separate categories. Their cosmology was holistic and integrative, seeing the natural and the supernatural, the mundane and the sacred, the living and the dead as interconnected aspects of a single, unified reality, and their art reflected this integrated worldview, weaving together practical, aesthetic, symbolic, and spiritual dimensions into a seamless whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. The legacy of the Oseberg discovery can also be traced in the development of experimental archaeology, a field that seeks to understand ancient technologies and practices through hands-on replication and testing. The Oseberg ship and its associated objects have inspired numerous experimental projects, from the construction of replica Viking ships to the recreation of the textile techniques represented in the burial, and these projects have yielded valuable insights into the skills, knowledge, and resources that were required to produce the artifacts found in the mound. The construction of a full-scale replica of the Gokstad ship in 1893 and its successful voyage across the Atlantic was one of the earliest and most dramatic examples of experimental archaeology, and it demonstrated that Viking ships were fully capable of the long-distance ocean voyages attributed to them in the literary sources. More recent projects have focused on the Oseberg ship itself, building replicas of varying scales and testing them in open water to assess their sailing characteristics and to understand the compromises that the ship's builders made between seaworthiness, speed, and visual splendor. These experiments have revealed that the Oseberg ship, while certainly capable of sailing in coastal waters and on the relatively sheltered waters of the Oslo fjord, was probably not designed for the kind of open ocean voyaging that the Gokstad ship was built to undertake. The Oseberg ship's relatively low freeboard, the distance between the waterline and the top of the hull, would have made it vulnerable to swamping in heavy seas, and its elaborate carvings, while visually spectacular, would have been impractical on a vessel intended for regular use in rough conditions, where they would have been exposed to constant abrasion and damage. This observation has led some scholars to suggest that the Oseberg ship may have been primarily a ceremonial or prestige vessel, a ship designed for display and for short-distance travel in calm waters rather than for the rigors of long-distance voyaging, a floating palace rather than a working warship, a conclusion that is consistent with the overall character of the burial as a statement of wealth, status, and aesthetic refinement. The experimental recreation of the textile techniques found in the Oseberg burial has been equally illuminating, revealing the extraordinary skill and patience required to produce the fabrics and tapestries that were found in the mound. Modern weavers who have attempted to reproduce the Oseberg textiles using the tools and techniques of the Viking Age have reported that the work is painstakingly slow and demanding, requiring years of practice to master and weeks or months of labor to produce even a small piece of finished fabric. The tablet weaving technique used to create the ornamental bands found in the burial is particularly complex, involving the manipulation of dozens of individual tablets, each threaded with multiple yarns of different colors, to produce intricate geometric and figurative patterns that are remarkable for their precision and their visual impact. The tapestry weaving technique used to create the pictorial panels is equally demanding, requiring the weaver to build up an image line by line, selecting and placing individual colored threads to create a design that can only be seen in its entirety when the work is complete. A process that requires not only technical skill, but also a sophisticated understanding of color, composition, and visual narrative. These experimental insights have deepened our appreciation for the textile arts of the Viking Age and have underscored the importance of women's work in Norse culture, a dimension of Viking Age life that is often overlooked in popular accounts that focus on warriors, raiders, and explorers. The textiles found in the Oseberg burial are not mere accessories or afterthoughts. They are masterworks of art and craftsmanship that represent an investment of time, skill, and creative vision comparable to that represented by the carved woodwork and the ship itself. The women who produced these textiles were artists in every sense of the word, and their work deserves to be recognized and celebrated alongside the achievements of the shipwrights and the woodcarvers who are more commonly associated with Viking Age artistic production. The broader context of Viking Age ship burial practices also deserves consideration, because the Oseberg burial, while exceptional in its richness and preservation, was not unique. Ship burials of varying scales and levels of elaboration have been found across the Norse world. From the great mounds of Vestfold to the boat graves of Birka in Sweden, the ship burials of Vendel and Valsgärde in Uppland, the boat burials of the Orkney and Shetland Islands, and the ship graves of the Norse settlements in Iceland, and even on the remote Atlantic island of Newfoundland, where the Norse established a short-lived settlement at Lanceau Meadows around the year 1000. The practice of burying the dead in ships or boats was not confined to any single region or social class. It was a widespread tradition that took many forms, from the lavish interments of the Vestfold kings and queens to the simple boat burials of ordinary farmers and fishermen, and it persisted from the pre-Viking period well into the 10th and even 11th centuries, gradually declining as Christianity spread through the Norse world and brought with it new ideas about death, burial, and the afterlife. The relationship between ship burial and the pre-Christian religion of the Norse is a topic that has generated a vast body of scholarly literature, and while many details remain uncertain, the broad outlines of the connection are reasonably clear. The ship, as we have seen, was a symbol of the journey to the afterlife, a metaphor made literal in the act of placing the dead aboard a vessel and sending them on their way, and this metaphor was rooted in a cosmology that understood the universe as a series of interconnected worlds separated by water, by the great ocean that surrounded Midgard, by the rivers that flowed through the underworld, and by the dark waters that the dead had to cross to reach their final destination. The inclusion of provisions, tools, and companions in the ship burial ensured that the dead would be properly equipped for this journey and for the life that awaited them on the other side, a life that was imagined as a continuation of earthly existence with all its pleasures and its demands, rather than as a radically different state of being. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity, which took place gradually over the course of the 10th and 11th centuries, brought an end to the tradition of ship burial, as the new faith introduced different ideas about the nature of death and the proper treatment of the dead. Christian burial practices emphasize the resurrection of the body, the importance of burial in consecrated ground, and the equality of all souls before God, concepts that were fundamentally at odds with the pagan tradition of elaborate, differentiated burials that expressed and reinforced social hierarchy. The transition from pagan to Christian burial practices was not sudden or uniform. In many parts of the Norse world, it took generations for the old customs to die out, and there is archaeological evidence of hybrid burial practices that combined elements of both traditions, reflecting a period of religious and cultural negotiation in which the old ways and the new coexisted, sometimes uneasily, in the same communities and even in the same families. The Oseberg burial, dating to the first half of the 9th century, belongs firmly to the pre-Christian period, and its lavishness and its adherence to traditional pagan forms suggest that the individuals responsible for the funeral were deeply committed to the old ways, either because they had not yet been significantly exposed to Christian influence, or because they consciously rejected it in favor of the ancestral traditions that had governed Norse life for centuries. The fact that the burial took place in Vestfold, a region that was one of the centers of royal power in early medieval Norway, and that may have been one of the last areas to fully embrace Christianity, is consistent with this interpretation, though the evidence is too thin to support definitive conclusions about the religious affiliations of specific individuals. The written sources that describe Viking Age funeral practices provide a valuable complement to the archaeological evidence, though they must be used with caution as they are often fragmentary, biased, or composed long after the events they describe. The most famous and most detailed account of a Viking ship funeral is the one provided by Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a member of an embassy sent by the Abbasid Caliph to the Volga Bulgars in 921 to 922, who encountered a group of Rus Vikings, Norse traders and warriors who had established themselves along the river routes of what is now Russia and Ukraine, and who witnessed the funeral of one of their chieftains. Ibn Fadlan's account, which has survived in several manuscripts of varying completeness, describes a funeral of extraordinary elaboration and disturbing violence, involving the preparation of the chieftain's body, the selection and ritual killing of a slave girl who was to accompany him into the afterlife, the loading of the funeral ship with weapons, food, and sacrificed animals, and the final conflagration in which the ship and everything in it was consumed by fire, sending the dead man and his companion to their destination in a pillar of smoke and flame. Ibn Fadlan's account has been the subject of intense scholarly scrutiny, and while some of its details have been questioned or reinterpreted, its core narrative is generally accepted as a broadly accurate description of a type of funeral practice that was known in the Norse world, though the specific details may have varied significantly from one region and period to another.